In the spring of 1942, Japan stood at the height of its power in the Pacific. After months of lightning victories that stretched from the Philippines to Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, Japanese leaders believed they were unstoppable. Yet, even with their vast empire, the Japanese High Command wanted to push farther. Their goal was to create a strong defensive ring that would keep the Allies far from the Japanese homeland and secure their new territories. They knew that if America and its allies recovered, they would strike back sooner or later. To prevent that, Japan planned to take control of key positions that could serve as shields and forward bases for further expansion. As part of this grand strategy, Japan's Imperial Navy turned its attention to two critical targets: Port Moresby in New Guinea and Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. Both places held immense strategic value. From Port Moresby, Japan could threaten northern Australia and block the route between the United States and Australia, a lifeline for Allied supplies. Tulagi, on the other hand, would serve as an important seaplane base and a stepping stone for operations deeper into the South Pacific. Controlling these 2 points meant Japan would dominate the entire northeastern approach to Australia, giving them unmatched control over sea routes and military movements in that region. The urgency behind this plan grew after April 18, 1942, when American bombers under Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle launched a daring raid on Tokyo. Though the physical damage was small, the psychological impact on Japan's leaders was massive. For the first time, they saw American bombs fall on their own cities. It was a clear warning that the United States could strike the Japanese homeland. Determined to prevent this from happening again, Japan decided to push its defensive perimeter farther south and east. Thus, the southern offensive, known as Operation MO, was approved. The main goal was simple yet ambitious: to cut Australia off from the rest of the Allies and isolate it completely. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inu was given command of the entire operation and tasked with carrying out this critical mission. Believing that American forces were still recovering from the early blows of the war, Japanese intelligence estimated that only one American aircraft carrier was operating in the region. Confident in this assumption, they formed a powerful naval force. Leading the strike were two of Japan's best aircraft carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, both of which had taken part in the attack on Pearl Harbor. They were supported by a smaller light carrier, several heavy cruisers, and a number of destroyers. Together, this armada represented one of Japan's most formidable fighting units. What the Japanese didn't know, however, was that American codebreakers had successfully cracked parts of their secret naval communications system. U.S. naval intelligence intercepted Japanese messages and discovered their entire plan, including the date and targets of the upcoming operation. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding the American task force, wasted no time. He organized his fleet around the carriers USS Yorktown, CV-5, and USS Lexington, CV-2, and prepared to intercept the Japanese in the Coral Sea. The other American carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, were too far away to participate in the coming battle, leaving Fletcher with only 2 carriers to face Japan's experienced fleet. On May 1, 1942, the carrier Lexington met up with Yorktown, and together they headed toward the Coral Sea. 2 days later, on May 3, Japanese forces under Vice Admiral Kiyohide landed on Tulagi and immediately began building a seaplane base to strengthen their hold. The very next morning, American reconnaissance spotted the activity. From a hidden position to the south, Yorktown launched a surprise airstrike. American planes swooped down on Tulagi, catching the Japanese completely off guard. In a matter of minutes, the newly established base was destroyed. The destroyer Kikuzuki and several smaller ships were sunk or damaged beyond repair. Once the raid was complete, Yorktown withdrew south to meet Lexington once again. The Japanese response was swift and fierce. Vice Admiral Teo Takagi was ordered to bring his main carrier force from the northern Solomons into the Coral Sea. His mission was clear: find and destroy the American fleet. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Artomo Goto continued escorting the invasion convoy headed for Port Moresby. Over the next 2 days, from May 5 to May 6, both sides searched desperately for one another. Dozens of reconnaissance planes scoured the vast sea, but heavy clouds and poor weather made the search difficult. American B-17 flying fortresses based on land also joined the effort, bombing Japanese ships, but the attacks caused little damage. On the night of May 6th, Admiral Fletcher made a bold move that could have changed the course of the battle. He sent a surface group of American and Australian cruisers and destroyers under Rear Admiral John Crace toward the Louisiana archipelago. Their task was to intercept any Japanese force attempting to reach Port Moresby. However, this decision came with great risk. Crace's ships would have no direct air support from the carriers. Still, Fletcher decided it was a risk worth taking to protect Port Moresby from invasion. By that night, both sides were ready, spread across the wide, stormy expanse of the Coral Sea. The stage was set for a new kind of battle, one that would make history as the first naval engagement where opposing ships fought without ever seeing each other directly. As dawn broke on May 7, 1942, the long-anticipated Battle of the Coral Sea began. Early that morning, a Japanese scout plane reported spotting what it believed was an American fleet to the north. Convinced by the report, Vice Admiral Takagi immediately ordered nearly 100 planes, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters, to take off from Shokaku and Zuikaku and strike the enemy. The Japanese pilots flew through the clouds and descended on their target, only to realize, to their shock, that it was not a fleet of American carriers at all. Instead, it was just the oiler US Neos and the destroyer US Sims. Though the targets were much smaller than expected, the Japanese pressed the attack with full force. Bombs rained down, and within moments the USS Sims was hit several times. She broke apart and sank rapidly, taking most of her crew with her. The USS Neos was also struck repeatedly, bursting into flames and drifting helplessly for days, before finally sinking on May 11th, after a few survivors were rescued by the destroyer USS Henley. By the end of that attack, the Japanese had wasted much of their striking power on secondary targets, leaving the American carriers completely untouched and still hidden somewhere in the vast ocean. Meanwhile, the Americans had also launched their own air groups to locate and attack the Japanese carriers. But due to mistaken reconnaissance reports, the American planes flew in the wrong direction, missing the main Japanese fleet. On their way back, however, they spotted a different group of Japanese ships, the invasion convoy protected by the light carrier Show. Without hesitation, American pilots from Lexington and Yorktown attacked in a perfectly coordinated strike. 53 dive bombers, 22 torpedo bombers, and 15 F-4F Wildcat fighters swooped down from the clouds. The attack was devastating. Within minutes, the Japanese light carrier was struck by at least 7 torpedoes and 13 bombs, exploding into flames. The sea around it boiled with debris, and the once proud ship began to sink beneath the waves. The Battle of the Coral Sea had only just begun, but already it was shaping into a turning point in the war. The moment when Japan's advance across the Pacific would finally begin to slow. The ship trembled violently as explosions tore through her structure. Within moments, flames engulfed every part of the vessel, turning it into a floating inferno. The fire spread so fast that crew members had little chance to escape. At 8:35 a.m., the once proud Japanese carrier slipped beneath the waves, taking 631 officers and sailors to a watery grave. Captain Kyoto Isawa, along with about 200 men, was later rescued by the destroyer Sazanami. For the Japanese Navy, this was a shocking and tragic moment. For the first time in the Pacific War, one of Japan's aircraft carriers had been sunk. The loss marked the end of Japan's illusion that its naval power was untouchable. When the message of victory reached the American fleet, Lieutenant Robert E. Dixon, a pilot aboard the USS Lexington, sent out an excited radio transmission that became legendary across the Allied forces. "Scratch one flat top." It was a short message, but it captured the joy and relief felt by everyone fighting to turn the tide of the war. The sinking of the carrier sent shockwaves through Japan's military command. Until then, they had believed that their defensive ring in the Pacific was strong enough to protect all their conquered territories. This single defeat proved otherwise. It showed that the Allies were beginning to strike back successfully, and it lifted Allied morale across the Pacific. After months of painful losses and retreats, this victory became a symbol of hope that the Japanese advance could be stopped. That same afternoon, May 7, 1942, another part of the battle unfolded. Rear Admiral John Crace led a surface task force made up of the cruisers HMAS Australia, HMAS Hobart, USS Chicago, and several destroyers. Their mission was to block any Japanese fleet trying to reach Port Moresby. The sea was rough, and visibility was low when Japanese torpedo bombers launched a sudden attack from Rabaul. The Allied ships immediately broke formation and began taking sharp turns to avoid the incoming torpedoes. The air filled with deafening blasts from anti-aircraft guns as gunners fired rapidly into the sky, creating a wall of flak. It was a tense, chaotic moment. Smoke and noise everywhere, planes diving and circling overhead. Despite the ferocity of the attack, the Allied captains maneuvered skillfully, and their ships suffered only light damage. Within minutes, the Japanese planes were forced to retreat, leaving the Allied sailors exhausted but relieved. Just when the tension seemed to fade, another crisis struck, this time caused by friendly fire. A squadron of US B-17 flying fortresses returning from a mission appeared above the Allied fleet. Poor weather and thick clouds made it hard to see clearly, and the bomber crews mistakenly identified Crace's ships as Japanese. Without hesitation, they dropped their bombs. Explosions roared around the fleet as water plumes shot high into the air. Miraculously, every bomb missed. No one was hurt, but the incident left the fleet shaken and reminded everyone just how unpredictable and confusing naval warfare could be. The men aboard the ships now understood that in these vast waters, danger could come not only from the enemy, but from their own side. Farther to the east, the Japanese carrier group was preparing a counterattack. The two remaining carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, had not yet been found by the Americans and were still undetected. Late that afternoon, they launched 27 planes, a mix of bombers and torpedo aircraft, to search for the U.S. fleet. However, their approach was spotted by American radar operators, and F-4F Wildcat fighters from USS Yorktown and USS Lexington scrambled to intercept them. A fierce dogfight followed high above the sea. The sky became a swirl of smoke trails, fire, and falling debris. The American pilots, flying aggressively, managed to shoot down 9 Japanese aircraft. The rest, seeing their losses grow, dropped their bombs into the ocean and turned back toward their carriers. None of the American ships were hit. Once again, the Japanese attack failed to inflict any real damage. As night fell, a strange and almost unbelievable event took place. A group of Japanese bombers returning from their failed mission became lost in the darkness. Low on fuel and confused, they mistook the silhouette of USS Yorktown for one of their own carriers and attempted to land on her deck. The American gunners couldn't believe what they were seeing. At first, they hesitated, unsure if these planes might be friendly. But when they realized the mistake, they opened fire to drive the bombers away. The startled Japanese pilots veered off at the last second, disappearing into the black sky. Moments later, 3 more enemy aircraft appeared, also trying to find their way home. This time, the Americans were ready and shot one of them down, the burning wreck plunging into the sea. The others fled into the night. It was a bizarre scene that showed just how confusing and unpredictable night operations at sea could be. By the end of the first day, the Allies clearly held the upper hand. They had destroyed 1 Japanese carrier, shot down many enemy planes, and kept both of their own carriers safe. The morale of the American crews was high, but everyone knew the fight wasn't over yet. The next day would decide who truly controlled the Coral Sea. At dawn on May 8, 1942, the final stage of the battle began. The morning sky was gray, and a light rain fell over the ocean. At 6 a.m., a reconnaissance seaplane from USS Lexington spotted the Japanese carriers on the horizon, several hundred kilometers away. The news reached Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher instantly. He didn't hesitate. He ordered a full-scale attack. Pilots scrambled to their planes as deck crews raced to prepare them for launch. Within minutes, the air was alive with the thunder of engines. Fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes from both Lexington and Yorktown roared into the sky, forming tight formations as they headed toward the Japanese fleet. Almost at the same time, the Japanese commander, Vice Admiral Takagi, located the American carriers and gave the same order to his men. From Shokaku and Zuikaku, waves of bombers and fighters lifted off the decks. Now both sides were launching nearly every aircraft they had left. By mid-morning, the two strike forces were speeding toward each other across the open sea, their targets roughly 320 kilometers apart. The tension grew with every passing minute. At around 10:20 a.m., alarms echoed across the American ships. Sailors raced to their battle stations as anti-aircraft guns began to fire. The Coral Sea turned into a boiling battlefield. In the skies above, American Wildcats clashed with Japanese Zeros in deadly dogfights, twisting and diving through bursts of tracer fire. Below them, the massive carriers zigzagged desperately to avoid torpedoes, while shells exploded all around. Japanese bombers broke through the defensive screen, dropping their deadly loads, while American planes plunged through flak clouds to strike Shokaku and Zuikaku. The battle raged with unrelenting fury. When the smoke finally began to clear, both fleets had taken heavy damage. On the Japanese side, Shokaku had been hit hard. At least 3 American bombs smashed through her deck, setting off huge fires that swept across the ship. Her crew fought desperately to contain the blaze, but the damage was severe. Her flight deck was ripped apart, and she could no longer launch or recover aircraft. The other carrier, Zuikaku, escaped by hiding in a sudden rain squall. Taking advantage of the weather, she disappeared from American sight and avoided serious damage. Shokaku, burning and listing badly, was forced to retreat under escort. Her deck was a wreck of twisted metal, aircraft remains, and burned debris. More than 100 sailors were dead and dozens more wounded. With one carrier crippled and the other unable to continue the attack, the Japanese had to withdraw from the fight. At the same time, the Japanese planes that had launched earlier reached the American fleet and began their own assault. The Wildcats guarding the carriers fought valiantly, shooting down 17 enemy aircraft before they could reach their targets, but some bombers still broke through. Flying low and fast, Nakajima B-5N torpedo planes attacked from both sides of USS Lexington, releasing their torpedoes in perfect coordination. 2 slammed into the carrier's port side, shaking the entire ship. Almost immediately, dive bombers followed, and 3 heavy bombs exploded on her flight deck, throwing sailors off their feet and sending towering columns of fire and smoke skyward. Lexington began to list 7 degrees to port. Her elevators jammed and fires raged across the lower hangars. Below deck, damage control crews fought desperately to contain the flames as smoke filled the corridors. The fate of the mighty carrier now hung in the balance. The legendary aircraft carrier Lady Lex, officially known as USS Lexington, was fatally wounded during the fierce combat. Flames had spread throughout her decks, and the smell of smoke filled the air as sailors fought desperately to save their beloved ship. Meanwhile, the USS Yorktown came under heavy attack from waves of Japanese bombers and torpedo planes. Her captain, Elliot Buckmaster, showed remarkable skill and composure under pressure, steering his vessel through the chaos. Torpedoes raced toward the Yorktown, leaving white trails across the sea, but through precise maneuvering, the captain successfully dodged all 8 that were fired at her. The crew cheered with relief, but their fight was far from over. A second wave of Japanese Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers appeared in the sky and descended swiftly, their engines screaming as they released bombs from above. The Yorktown avoided most of the bombs, but one struck near the rear of the ship, piercing through the flight deck and exploding in the hangar below. The force of the blast shook the entire ship, tearing through steel and igniting multiple fires. Black smoke poured from the openings as crew members scrambled to contain the damage. The explosion killed or wounded 66 sailors, and for a moment it seemed as though Yorktown might not survive. Yet her crew acted with incredible discipline and courage. Firefighting teams rushed into the burning areas with hoses, extinguishers, and their bare determination. They fought the flames for hours, containing the inferno that threatened to destroy the carrier. Despite the destruction, the Yorktown remained operational, moving steadily through the waves. Her ability to stay afloat and fight on became a symbol of American resilience at sea. By the afternoon of May 8, 1942, the Lexington was still ablaze, her decks blackened and twisted by fire. Around 1 o'clock, through the heroic efforts of her exhausted crew, the fires were finally brought under control. The sailors, drenched in sweat and smoke, managed to stabilize the massive ship and keep her moving at a steady speed of 25 knots. There was a brief moment of hope. Perhaps Lady Lex could still be saved. But fate had other plans. Without warning, a violent explosion thundered from deep inside the ship. Gasoline fumes that had gathered in the lower compartments suddenly ignited, setting off a chain reaction of devastating blasts. The explosions tore through the carrier's structure, ripping apart bulkheads and sending fire roaring across the decks. The flames consumed everything in their path, and soon the Lexington was engulfed from bow to stern. Captain Frederick C. Sherman, realizing that the ship could no longer be saved, gave the heartbreaking command to abandon ship. It was a moment filled with grief and disbelief for the men who had served aboard her. Nearby American destroyers and cruisers rushed to help, pulling survivors from the sea amid drifting smoke and debris. Over 2,700 crew members were rescued, but 216 officers and sailors perished with their vessel. Even as her crew watched from a distance, Lexington refused to sink. Her fires burned bright against the darkening sky as the waves crashed against her sides. Finally, to prevent her from falling into enemy hands, the destroyer USS Phelps was ordered to deliver the final blow. The ship fired 5 torpedoes into Lexington's hull. With one last thunderous explosion, the once mighty carrier slipped beneath the surface at 7:56 p.m., vanishing into the dark depths of the Coral Sea. It was the end of a proud and brave ship, one that would forever be remembered for her sacrifice. That night, Japanese commanders gathered to assess the situation. Although they had managed to sink one American carrier, their own fleet had suffered serious damage. Their air power was weakened, and they no longer had the strength to protect their invasion forces. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, who commanded Operation Mo, faced a difficult decision. After reviewing the losses and the condition of his ships, he decided to call off the planned invasion of Port Moresby and ordered his fleet to retreat from the Coral Sea. He hoped to preserve what was left of his naval power for future battles. The decision, however, angered Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the overall commander of the Japanese combined fleet. Yamamoto wanted the remaining American carriers destroyed and insisted that the attack continue. He ordered Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi to pursue the retreating American fleet toward the south. For 2 long days, on May 9th and 10, Takagi's forces searched the open sea, but they found nothing. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher had already withdrawn the American task force as ordered, taking his damaged ships to safety. By the night of May 10th, the Japanese warships turned north, officially ending the campaign. The Battle of the Coral Sea had come to an end after 4 days and nights of relentless combat. It was a historic moment, the first naval battle in history fought entirely by aircraft, with opposing fleets never directly seeing each other. It marked the beginning of a new era in modern warfare, where the power of aircraft would dominate the seas. The results of the battle were costly for both sides. The Japanese Navy lost a light carrier and 1 destroyer. The fleet carrier Shokaku was heavily damaged and forced to withdraw for repairs. In total, Japan lost around 69 aircraft. The U.S. Navy also suffered serious losses. The carrier USS Lexington was gone, along with the destroyer USS Sims and the large fuel ship USS Neosho. The USS Yorktown was badly damaged, and about 65 American aircraft were destroyed. Despite the heavy losses, both sides claimed victory in their wartime reports. Tokyo celebrated the sinking of the Lexington, while Washington praised its success in stopping Japan's advance. Each side exaggerated the other's losses for propaganda purposes. However, when viewed from a larger strategic perspective, the Battle of the Coral Sea was a turning point for the Allies. Although the U.S. Navy had lost more ships in the short term, the battle achieved something far greater. It stopped Japan's expansion toward the south and protected Australia from invasion. For the first time since the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan's unstoppable momentum had been broken. The victory gave hope to Allied forces who had faced months of defeat and retreat. It proved that Japan could be resisted and that its fleet was not invincible. The battle also had far-reaching consequences. The Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, both damaged or short of planes, were unable to participate in the crucial Battle of Midway just 1 month later. The Americans, on the other hand, managed to repair the Yorktown in record time. Within days, she was ready for battle once again. At Midway, Yorktown joined other U.S. carriers to deliver a devastating strike that sank 4 Japanese fleet carriers, changing the entire direction of the Pacific War. By halting Japan's advance, protecting Australia, and paving the way for future Allied victories, the Battle of the Coral Sea became known as the heroic prelude to the Battle of Midway, the fight that truly turned the tide of the Pacific conflict.